In many churches across this great land and around the world, clergy stand up each Sunday and speak to you, to those who are in front of them, on texts that are drawn from the Bible and sorted out according to the lectionary. It's a discipline that challenges them to look at the texts and a variety of texts chosen by an ecumenical group for thematic purposes. But it sometimes seems so easy. I wish I had a book that said, okay, use this week, or use that next week, or use something else, because coming up with a new topic each week is sometimes a stretch. But what the purpose of this conversation is, the perspectives that we try to create here, is to challenge us to get a little further along that work of recognizing our groundedness in the interconnectedness of life, the value of love that we seek to live by and to grow in wisdom. The challenge is, I can tell you to do that, but giving you a little bit of a tool that might, be worth something on Wednesday over lunch, that's the trick. So, I'm constantly looking for little tools. And for the next few weeks, the tool is going to be color. We're going to talk about different colors. And I'm going to weave them together with thoughts so that you might use that to consider different ways of seeing, holding concepts, judging what decision to make, just to place some values in front of you in a unique way. You're all familiar with the color spectrum, and I'm choosing 7 colors that are fairly traditional and well known to each of us, and hopefully over the course of that we'll come up with some interesting things to engage us. The first color I'm bringing you is the color purple, and I didn't even think about that when I put my top on today. I was thinking of Scott's tie when I put my top on today, right? But the color purple is what we're going to look at. And I have some slides, and I'm going to get Carrie to pull us through them as I ask for them. But purple is a mix of red and blue, as we know. Apparently it doesn't actually have a spot on the spectrum. It's just kind of a mix of things. So designers say that it's the perfect, warm and cool color for rooms perhaps that you want to be ultimately confused in. I'm not sure. But the color is that mix of warm and cool that many people like. And indeed, children under 5, 70% of children under 5 will identify purple as their favorite color. Now, I have no idea if that's linked with the Hasbro toy of the year, or if that's without that influence, if they still choose purple as their favorite color. But it is a color that many, many people do like. The color purple, down through history, has been an elusive one, other than how we have seen it in nature. It's in flowers, and you see it in the sunset. But creating the color purple was a challenge. There was, however, and Carrie, can you give us this first slide here? There was, however, found on the beach a little mollusk known as a murex that, if dug out of its shell and left to sit in the sun for a period of time, would change colors on the way to being eventually red, but purple was one of those colors. And so long, long ago, that Tyrian purple, because Tyre was the city that it mostly was made in, was a very popular color, but very expensive to make, because it took thousands of these poor little mollusks set out in the sun for precisely the right amount of time to create the dye that would then, can we have the next slide, color the robes of those who could afford them. So purple became known as a color that was associated with authority, with leadership, with those who had royal privilege and wealth. And the whole infrastructure of Tyre was almost brought to its knees when the emperor decreed that only the emperor and his entourage were able to use the color purple. You can imagine what that would do to an industry or to a town based entirely on the development of that color. So the privilege that was associated with the color has gone down through time. We now, Carrie, if you can bring it forward, we now use it, we see it used within ecclesiastical circles and for bishops. Bishops in the Catholic and the Anglican churches wear purple as their color. And it is a color that in the church is also used to recognize royalty and to lead into, in those sacramental traditions, to lead into the seasons of Lent, lead up to Christmas and lead up to Easter in the seasons of Advent and the seasons of Lent. Seasons that are to call us to reflection, to think about the stories involved in those and what our response to them should be within the Christian community. Now, that color is a great color for an alb, don't you think? I mean, in the United Church, when we didn't really subscribe to bishops and stuff, it might be thought that that color could be used for an alb, and it was. That's the color of the alb that I used to wear. You'll read a little bit about that in the Salt Shaker. I have an article coming out in that about my alb, my purple alb. And some of you who are longer-term members of the congregation will remember me wearing that alb. The last time I wore it was at Betty Henderson's daughter's wedding. That's the very last time I wore my alb. And it's been in my closet low these many years, and I have just taken it home. And I'll tell you a little story about that later. But I want to go first to the next slide. Everyone recognizes this, right? Do you know that Cadbury actually has the patent on ecclesial purple? Did you know that? They do. Back in October 2012, it was ruled that they had the right to exclusively use that color. I'm not sure how the Church of England is going to respond to that, but they did respond individually. The reason that Cadbury went to court with this was that a chocolate company called Meaningful Chocolate Company put out at Advent and at Lent chocolates wrapped in ecclesiastical purple, which Cadbury jumped on because they thought that it was interfering with their business. Meaningful Chocolate, of course, was a fair trade chocolate, which was brought out at that season of meaning and is distributed through some of the dioceses in the Church of England. So one bishop did come out and, recognizing that the judge had found that Cadbury had the right to limit the use of ecclesiastical purple in their chocolates, still called for Cadbury to take the higher road because it would just not look nice to try to own a color that had been in use for centuries for other purposes. So I'm not sure how far Cadbury went with that, but it has been a challenge. Back to the alb. I think the next slide is a picture of, yes, votes for women. The suffrage movement chose purple as one of their colors, and there's some discrepancy about why it was chosen. It began being used in the UK, but was then brought to America for use in the suffrage movement, generally depicting dignity and loyalty. Some say it was just a favored color of one of the leaders, and so that's how it ended up. But you could order from a catalog a suffrage kit, which would have ribbons and a little hat and buttons, so that you could go, and actually it had tickets so that you could go and participate in the suffrage march that was taking place in Washington that year. So it was a very popular item, and this little picture of the purple pansies is a symbol of that. My alb, my purple alb, had to do with the suffrage movement. I felt that purple was a color that spoke about women and the rights of women, and so coming into a predominantly, at that time, male-dominated tradition, my purple alb was a symbol of that. It wasn't really taken that way, though, when a local clergy person was being installed, and all of the leaders of the local congregations were invited to participate, so I show up in my purple alb, which the Catholics and the Anglicans didn't take so well. They thought it was a bit presumptuous of me to wear purple, but it did have a very humble beginning. On to what it is I want to share with you about the color purple. Out of all of the significant meanings and the suggested influences that purple has over our lives, I've chosen the idea of dignity as a color that purple speaks to. predominantly because purple is the color that has been used for royalty and for those who in privileged position and is associated with wealth. It seemed to me that it would be important for that group in society to recognize the dignity of all. I think the next slide is, oh, thanks. Can we go to the next one? Sorry? To the Maslow's triangle. Yes, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're all familiar with this hierarchy of needs. The most basic of which, the broadest part of that triangle, is the one that talks about our basic needs. And I've got that on the next slide so you don't have to try to read that. If you could bring that up, Carrie. There. Biological and physiological needs. This is the basis of the human needs on Maslow's hierarchy. Our basic life needs are air, food, drink, shelter, warmth, sex, and sleep. Now, there's one of those that doesn't seem to be a basic life need, and I just want to point out that sex is on there because humanity wouldn't survive without sex. But both genders will actually survive without sex. As long as someone else is reproducing, we're good. So I know it's probably a contentious issue in your homes as well, but the basic life needs. Sex there is for the continuation of the human race, and sex for intimacy comes somewhat higher on Maslow's triangle. Just want to let you know it does show up there. But our basic biological needs, I want you to consider, I was with a friend this week who was being queried about whether or not they were privileged by an acquaintance of theirs. And the person said, "Do you consider that you are a privileged person?" And that person said, "Yes, I do now, but I wasn't privileged as a child." And they said, "Well, tell me more about that." And they said, "Well, you know, my parents didn't have a lot of money, and I didn't have a lot of lessons that I could take, different, things to do. I did have piano lessons." And the person poked at those things. "So you had piano lessons?" "Yes." "So you had a piano?" "Yes." "So you had a house that the piano was in?" "Yes." And I want you to think about those things in terms of privilege, because I want you to look at this list and consider being without one or two of those things on a regular basis. Without one or two of those things, or all of them, we rapidly lose our sense of dignity. We rapidly become dependent on others to provide those things. And we will do almost anything to get them. That's another thing that tells you that sex maybe isn't there, because we will sell ourselves for sex in order to get food for our children. But we haven't generally sold our food in order to get sex, right? So it's obvious that that need is very different. But humans will degrade themselves or be degraded by others if they don't have those very basic things. And so when I'm considering the color purple and this layer of society that it was historically related to, despite the fact that it isn't now, the word is still associated with authority, with dignity, with loyalty, with value, a very high intrinsic value in the individuals that are accorded the color purple. Herman Melville has a quote about purple: "Whether in purple or in rags, acting ill toward one another is of no account. Wickedness is the same in purple or in rags. It's wickedness." And so a loss of dignity, or the taking away of dignity, is part of that purple thing that degrades us. So what I'm trying to say, perhaps I'm not being very clear, this idea that an upper level of society is responsible for the most basic needs of all in society is the thought I want you to take away with you with the color purple today. That those who are the most gifted, the most privileged, have the most access to choice in whatever area they wish to use it or exercise it in their lives, Those are the individuals that must be the most responsible for ensuring that the basic needs of individuals are met. And so those that I'm associating with the color purple, because historically they have been associated with that, are those that we most depend upon to ensure that everyone has those basic life needs. Now, we live in a very privileged society. We talk about going for surgeries that others in the world and other places of the world would never dream of. We talk about access to education that many in other areas of the world would never even consider or even know was available. We have communications and transportation systems that we use on an everyday basis without even thinking about it. We are not at this level, most of us, at any point in our lives, although I think that some of the situations and realities of many people in our country can fall into this. But those around the world who live with this, with having these needs met, getting these needs met on a daily basis, are the ones who are the most at risk for losing dignity, and we must take care of it for them. Aung San Suu Kyi is an activist, a Burmese activist, who has over decades brought the plight of people to the forefront and spoken about it over and over again, so that the world might hear and know. And in her book, the quote that Deb shared with you, she talks about those basic everyday things that people do. And in a culture of fear, where an authority tells you what you have access to and what you don't, and what you may or may not do, we might too be able to give up those little dignities that make us human on a day-to-day basis. But she calls for people not to do that. That in the face and in a culture of fear, to yet look to caring for one's own dignity. And that sometimes that can be an incredibly courageous act, to hold on to oneself in the face of the loss of all those things that might be considered one's own, taken away by a government, by a people, by a force that speaks against human dignity. So as we move through these colors and we find ways that they've been used historically, and you choose to paint your entire house with them based on what they are, I want you to take just this piece away, that we must always knit those in the highest echelons together with the needs of those in the lowest, so that we might all live in dignity, and dignity might be something that shines forth from us all.